All right, and now it's time for our talk. I will hand it off to Shums, CTO of Hatchways, and he'll tell you how to walk through your project and interview. I'll stop screen sharing so he can take over.
Perfect. All right. Thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect.
And I stop sharing, so you should be able to now if you need to.
Yeah, let me try. Give me 1 second to do that. All right. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Yeah. So as mentioned, I'm from Hatchways. We're gonna do a quick presentation on what is the project walkthrough interview and kind of how to perform well in that interview setting. Jacqueline, we also have Jacqueline here from Hatchways as well, and she'll be there to kind of help assist me with questions as we go through the presentation. One thing we do like to make this a pretty kind of informal talk, and feel free to ask questions at any point in the conversation, either through the chat or to kind of even just chime in through audio. There's less than 30 of us, it should be manageable. In terms of what I'll go over today, I'm going to do a quick introduction about Hatchways, what we do here. Why do we know a little bit about interview processes and why we can kind of help you in that way. Then I'll go over some technical interview types. So what are the different types of technical interviews that we've seen in a more general way, just so that you can kind of see what's out there and how does this specific interview process that I'm going to go over today fit within that the whole interview process as a whole. Then, because I'm talking specifically about project-based interviews, and to define what that is, it's basically where you're presenting a project in an interview and walking through that project. It makes sense for me to talk about what makes a good project. At Hatchways, we focus a lot on web development, so that's kind of front-end and back-end development. And so for that reason, the focus of the talk is going to be a lot on like how to improve web development-based projects, but it can apply to kind of mobile development or other types of software development. And then lastly, I'm going to go over kind of what is the project walkthrough interview and kind of what does that involve, and then lastly some an extra spot for question and answer. All right, starting with an introduction, what is Hatchways' goal? Our goal is to help junior and intermediate programmers get their first job or really their next job as a software engineer. We work with kind of a large range of developers, but the point is, how do we do it? We evaluate your skills. This is through project-based assessments. So kind of think of doing take homes or doing some kind of work trials. And then based off of that, we'll provide feedback on how you do, and then we'll set up interviews with tech startups for you. So we're a sourcing and pre-vetting platform at kind of a big picture. My background is currently the CTO of Hatchways and been working on that for more than 2 years now. Then prior to that, I was an engineering hiring manager at Kik, and then was a CTO of a smaller startup that was acquired by Kik. More relevant is at Hatchways, we've done a ton of interviews with software developers, both assessing take-home assessments, but also interviewing them in many ways. So I've met more than like 500 plus software developers, probably even more than that now. And we work with 200 plus companies. So I've seen a lot of people interviewing, and that's pretty much what I've been doing for the past 2 years. So kind of seen a lot of different ways that interviews are done in the space. In terms of technical interview types, kind of a very high level, I'm sure for those that have gone through this process are familiar with the general rounds. There is the phone screen. It's not necessarily has to be a phone screen, but there's kind of like the first filtering step that companies do, where they do some sort of behavioral interview. Sometimes if they're technical, they'll ask you knowledge-based questions. This is a JS group, so a lot of JS related roles will ask specific questions about about JavaScript? Do you know kind of more later and modern versions of JavaScript and things like that? They may ask you more specifics to go through a project-based walkthrough. So, and I'll go through what that process more involves in the future slides. Then there's usually a technical first screen. Sometimes the phone screen and technical screen is kind of coupled together. At this point, they're going to do something that's a bit more technical. So either a take home, maybe there's some database algorithm questions, maybe it's another knowledge-based interview, or maybe it's another project walkthrough. And like I mentioned, sometimes the phone screen and the technical first screen is kind of coupled together. Then companies generally do some sort of on-site. It's not really on-site at all anymore, but they still call it on-site and people get confused, but it's pretty much a longer interview process that involves some sort of more in-depth technical. That can be also data structure algorithm, so like leak code or HackerRank style questions, or it can be a pair programming session, which is more common for web development or JavaScript related roles to do, like, you know, pair with me on this React project or pair with me on this Node.js project or something like that. Or they may do like a system design interview. And then the final interview is kind of behavioral and system design. So what you can take away from this specific slide is that the interview type that I'm going to walk in depth today, which is the project walkthrough, happens generally early in the process. And it's not really even a formal interview. You may not even know that it's a project-based walkthrough interview. And the reason I go through this talk is it usually helps a lot of more non-traditional talent get through the first screen, because often they're looking for experience, and projects can be a replacement of experience. And that's what we've noticed because we've worked a lot with more junior talent. So what is the project walkthrough? In the first or second round, interviewers always ask about, you know, tell me about yourself, or go through an experience or anything like that. And it's pretty much a chance for you to showcase your work. And so that's why I always say that this interview is not necessarily an actual interview style, because sometimes companies don't know. It's just an opportunity for you to seize, to be able to say, I'm ready to like look through and walk through my project. And you can very much impress interviewer at the early stage if you are prepared to kind of demo your project. So generally, you know, there's a couple questions that can be asked that can prompt you to say, can I walk you through my project? Or let me show you a little bit about my portfolio. So examples are when you asked about solving a difficult problem, when you're asked about showing an example of work that you did in a team or any challenges that you faced, showing an accomplishment, or telling them about a specific problem or project that you worked on. Keep in mind that you know, showing a project really mind blows like a recruiter. Sometimes, or whoever you're talking to at that stage. Sometimes though, it's not always appropriate, but there's no harm in asking. You know, if it's literally a phone screen and you're on the phone, it may be hard to show it. But if it's nowadays, a lot of people are using video chat or Zoom or things like that. It's always great to be ready to be like, I'm ready to show you my project or show you a project that I've worked on. Keep in mind that, like I mentioned, sometimes they'll say like, no, I mean, that's not exactly what I want to go through. So be prepared to both talk through your project, but also to demo it and demonstrate what you have completed. So before I go more into depth about this specific interview style and like how to actually walk through your project, I actually want to talk about what makes a good project, because kind of coming to the specific workshop, it's good to have a good idea of like how to build a strong portfolio that can make you shine. And this can help you not only with the interview process, but with your resume. This specific presentation really helps candidates that don't have work experience. Of course, you know, relevant work experience can be more important than a great project, of course, relevant. But having and showing that curiosity on building a project on your own on the side generally always helps your portfolio. And there's always companies that we interview with that like, does this person have a great side project? What do they do outside of you know, their regular work hours? So we wanted to kind of go and talk about what makes a great project. So a couple recommendations. Number one is the technology that you use matter in a project. Because it's your chance to demonstrate that you have the right technology stack for this company that you're interviewing with. So try to use modern technology. is like when I mean by that, like, common languages that companies are using, and like, MERN stack or kind of something of the equivalent, or even better using TypeScript or something kind of more modern that people use right nowadays. So try to be modern and up to date is the kind of first recommendation. I also always get asked this question about, like, sometimes companies say stack doesn't matter, or I can learn quickly, but the reality is stack always matters. And the reason that stack always matters is because if you have one candidate with the technology stack that's exactly the same as you, they're obviously going to choose the one with the technology stack. So it always matters, even if people don't say it matters. I have a question here. Okay, does having a project portfolio really overcome the previous work experience? The answer is yes and no. The reason it is yes is because it really helps. But the reason that I say it's no is, like, if a company has a bias towards saying, like, we need work experience, you're not going to overcome that. It's really hard to overcome it. You kind of need to find the company that is open to not having work experience. And if a company is open to not having work experience, what is going to separate you? Like, think concretely, what is going to separate you from the thousands of other applicants? It could be a degree, it could be your grades. But if you're coming to like something like this, you're probably like interested in building things. So why not make it something that you've built that's kind of can outshine all of those other things? So and also tips, we're not going through a tips on resume workshop, but there's a lot of tips on writing a good resume. There's one that if you find on Free Code Camp that talks about how to make a killer software engineering resume. It puts a large focus on projects and skills. And I think that projects and skills can really help you shine out. And it also helps getting past filtering systems because it shows you have specific technology experience. So if you, for example, do not have experience with React, which is so common nowadays, go build a project with React and now you can put it on your resume. So the next one is full stack and functional. Make your project functional. And the reason what I mean by that is, like, make it something that people can see. This might not help you with the resume stage because to some extent that question is right, that a lot of people are using filtering techniques and they rarely go deep into your portfolio. So it's all about writing the project well at the resume stage on your resume itself, but making it functional will help in the future stages. So when you're displaying your project in a phone screen, when you're displaying it in the final interview, a lot of the candidates that we work with, we do projects with candidates, so this is how we know. They talking about their project is really what drives them to kind of get past the later stages of the interview and getting through the process. May not help as much, making it functional and displayable in the early stages, but it's very important for the later stages to do that. This is because we work with a lot of front-end developers, and sometimes they're like, front-end developers build very basic apps because they're like, I want to be just a front-end developer. But our recommendation there is, like, you need to show some level of complexity, and it's very hard to show a certain level of complexity without demonstrating like you can connect to an API or like showing that you can work with APIs or things like that. That doesn't mean you need to build the backend like really well. You could use third-party APIs or things like that. It just means it needs to be functional, displayable, and done well. We have another question here. Okay, there's more of a comment. All right. Next point is an interesting one, making the project look good. And there's ways to do this without being a designer. You shouldn't feel like design is your bottleneck. One way to do that is just copy designs. So replicate an existing website. Like, I want to take Instagram and build a replica of it. You don't need design for that. You can even inspect the web page and try to build it very close to what it is done. So that's actually more effective and generally more impressive, is to build a really nice website that's like not original than to build something that you thought was original and thought looked good but may not look good. So oftentimes with these projects, they're done with non-technical people or technical leads, and making it look good is great. I want to caveat that though, if you are a backend specialist and are really interested in certain backend things, you can really blow away people's minds with a poor looking project, as long as it looks good from a perspective of like It's well-organized code. It's easy to use, well-tested, well-documented. To give you some examples of projects that blew my mind that have no front ends, one candidate builds a project that ingests a ton of data about, this was a long time ago, so I don't know if this API can do more now, but ingested a ton of data about New York Times like stops on the subway, and built it so well on the back end with such high level of efficiency using a combination of using protobuf for like low latency, so not even a RESTful API. Sorry, not using like kind of JSON, using protobuf, use microservices, use Redis for caching. It was crazy. Why? Because they used this app to get subway stop information while being on the subway, so handling super low latency, and did it in like extremely low amount of data being sent, and that was mind-blowing. They got a job from our platform with no degree, completely self-taught. So like, it's possible. You just kind of need to blow people's mind away, especially if you want to do backend. You kind of have to kind of think of something creative that pushes you beyond just a basic CRUD app that like shows, you know, basic functionality. The next one is kind of self-explanatory. Use best practices. Research how to structure your application well. Don't, you know, there's no point of not researching that. Kind of take some time to think about that. And then lastly, make it challenging. So someone's asked, how do you avoid the basic like kind of CRUD apps? And the answer is like, it's actually quite formulaic, and a lot of candidates don't know this. So by making it formulaic, you can solve this problem pretty easily. Introduce something a little bit more complicated. And here are I don't know if I actually go through a couple examples beforehand. I do. Okay, here's a couple of examples of how to make it more challenging to avoid basic kind of just doing CRUD functionality. So one is very, very basic. It's not like super impressive. A lot of candidates do it. So I mean, I just expect it as a kind of a basic thing, is to do user session management. So building some sort of pass and login system. Lots of people do it, but can you do it right? And can you learn about it right? So the reason I like this one as an example is because so many interview processes nowadays talk and focus in on this because it's so crucial to web. So fundamental concepts like, are you avoiding common attacks like, you know, CRSF or like XSF cross scripting, and how do you avoid those attacks? How should you store it? Are you doing token or session based auth? What are the pros and cons of both? How do you avoid, you know, certain attacks? How do you store your token? Is it in local storage? Is it in HTTP only cookies? So just kind of digging deeper, you could probably spend the whole time doing one project on that and go really in depth. And it could be a really good use of time, actually, as long as you kind of explain it well in your resume. But going beyond that, how do you go beyond that? You do things like task queues or sockets or web scraping. So here are some very basic examples. So task queues, that's kind of running asynchronous tasks in your backend. Some common examples is, let's say you want to build an app that needs some parallelization or like sends thousands of emails. You may not send thousands of emails. Why do you need to do that? But you want to build an app that shows you can do that. So you use task queues, or you build something kind of with task queues involved. We have one app that we have candidates build that's basically a replica of like an email sales CRM tool. So you can send thousands of emails to people that you upload. That's kind of a cool app. There's so much complexity you can add to it. You know, upload a CSV and pull all their emails from the CSV and spit it into your backend. That's pretty hard. That's not like super trivial. Another example is sockets. So taking the same example, what if you send emails to thousands of people on the task queue, and when they you know, respond to those emails, you have some webhooks to listen to responses from the Gmail API or something like that, and then you send socket events from the back end to the front end to update the UI saying somebody responded to your email. I'm coming up with a really interesting, challenging project. So sockets is a great example. You can use libraries. I'm not saying go everything from scratch, but sockets is a really good example to build interesting things. Taking it in a completely different direction, you could build an app that is a game, like a replica of a game that you build online. That would be interesting and compelling. And if it's real time, hard, and maybe people will use it. So those are kind of like examples of going beyond using task queue sockets or scraping, and web scraping as well. Like, always impresses companies when you're like, how did you seed all this data into your database? Oh, I scraped like a couple websites. So kind of going a bit deeper. The next one is attention to detail. So sometimes a great project is literally, it is a CRUD app, but it's just so well thought out, and you did like pixel perfect replica of front end, and you're applying to a front end job, and you use reusable components on the front end, and it's beautiful. That's a great project in itself as well. Use some interesting APIs. I love Stripe as an example because it's payments. Payments are cool. You can go really in depth in it. You can go really custom. You can get hard and easy really quickly. Google Vision API is cool as well, but you know what? It's actually pretty simple. I think Stripe is kind of a cool one to use. Next is like, you can go deeper by building things more from scratch and not leveraging a library for everything. So like, build a rich text editor from scratch. That would be really hard. I mean, not from scratch, but like maybe using a framework. But it'd still be something very hard to use to build, because you'd have to manage state in that, and it can get very complicated very quickly. Build a build a Zoom replica or a Jitsi web replica, basically. WebRTC plus sockets. Pretty interesting. WebRTC is pretty easy to use. You'd be surprised what's out there and how easy it is to impress a company because they haven't seen things like that, basically. So a couple more example ideas. Replicate a website. I use that as an example. That is generally more challenging than you'd expect. If I told everybody to replicate Facebook, sounds relatively easy, but the feed, for example, like how do you show an optimized feed for all your friends and show important content first, can be complicated. It can go even more complicated. So those are great example projects. Another one is, this one is like, if you're applying to small companies, it's great to do something more startup-y, like coming up with an idea on your own. That can also impress companies both from a technical and non-technical perspective. If you're applying for purely technical roles and you're not interested in like small teams or like small startups, it's not so valuable, because sometimes you can hurt yourself by thinking that your idea is great and like you can do all the stuff yourself. But like I mentioned before, it's sometimes easier to just replicate a design. So there's always ways around that. If you're not great at coming up with ideas, I get a lot of people asking me like, I can't make a project because I don't have any good ideas. You don't need it. Just kind of follow somebody else's work. So this is loading. I don't know why it's loading. Okay. Hold on, give me a second. Oh, weird. Okay. Let me just present this. Let's see if I try presenting it again. No. Okay, I'm going to present that slide from here. So a couple notes on how to present the project high level. On GitHub, this is really important, because especially if you're putting this on your resume, the most important thing in presentation of your project, outside of having a good description for it, is having a good README. I think a comment was made before about how recruiters they don't go that deep into your portfolio, and that's true. But if they are interested at the current level of at least clicking on it, your README is like the first thing that they'll see if you're sharing a GitHub link. So making that README detailed, putting GIFs. I think this page is not loading because there's a GIF on it. A GIF of like the project in your README to kind of make it easy to see what complexity you did is very important. And I don't know what's up. A lot of times developers don't want to put the effort into that, but that little bit of effort into that part of presentation can go a long way. The next one is, it's important, but not as important, because I used to value this a lot, but deploying it is only important if the person is interested enough to kind of look through it and build and play around with it. So it's more important in later stages, but at the same time, if they're going to get on a call with you, generally you have a chance to demonstrate it. So as long as you can display it, it's kind of important. Lastly, sometimes projects are harder to share. Find a way to share them. If you can't share them at all, get really good at talking about them is really the reality. Creating a private repo for you to invite them to, or creating a login for them. These are all great ways to get around the inability to share projects with people. Oh, wrong button. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay, so the actual project walkthrough interview. So as I mentioned before, there's no formal like walkthrough interview. Nobody's gonna ask you, like, rarely will they ask you, can you walk me through your project? But they will ask you a question like, tell me something you worked on recently. So that's your time to kind of seize the opportunity because you were ready and you watched this presentation to show your project and to be like, to kind of lead it. And so that's why this type of interview style is difficult, because you're kind of leading it, you're taking ownership over it. It also can be difficult because you've probably forgotten how you implemented something a long time ago, and it's very important before you come to the presentation to refresh your mind. And then lastly, sometimes you've done projects in groups and you don't remember everything. So in that sense, you need to be able to explain the whole application, because if you go into a project walkthrough interview and you're like, I worked on this, and then they dig deeper that like they feel like you didn't do anything and that was your whole team that did it, that's a really bad situation to kind of be into. Of course, you want to be still honest and share the honest fact that others worked on it, but if you can explain it, it shows that you understood it and conceptualized it and were able to kind of work off of their specific code. So a couple of things to be prepared. If you're going into a video interview, have your projects ready to be shared. As long as it's quick to start it. It doesn't need to be like, if it's gonna slow your computer down or things like that, doesn't not need to be like running in the background. And of course, I know that can be a pain, because as I said, you might not actually have the chance to walk through the project, but it's good to have it up and running. Definitely test your project beforehand. I've walked through a lot of projects with candidates. There's a lot of, maybe like 50% of the time there's bugs in it, and it's very embarrassing because usually the bug is like, I forgot to seed the data properly, and they think it's not a bug. So just walk through your project beforehand so you're ready to show it. And then lastly, and most importantly, is a lot of these interviews are about digging deeper into answering questions about your code. So like, how did you tackle this feature? Or how, if I went on this web page, what happens? And be prepared to talk about your project, to answer these questions, but also to show code if it comes down to it. It's also good to kind of, when you answer these questions, know what level of detail a company is looking for. Like oftentimes when I ask questions, people don't know the answer. So an example could be like, when I go to this page, what happens? Sometimes I get an answer that's like, well, they go way too detailed. For example, like, it first, hits the DNS server. And then I'm like, this is not relevant to the project that I'm talking about. So I want to see like things like, what API calls are you making? What gets loaded on the page? Like kind of the really what they're trying to look for, like that relationship between the back end and front end and how you architect your solution. In terms of the actual interview, so when you're kind of in the first screen, as I mentioned, the interviewer may not explicitly ask it to you. So it's a time for you to show your extra preparedness in that interview process. So for example, someone's asking you, tell me a time of when you worked on something, challenging, and you have your project ready to show. You can explain the project. So I actually worked on this team project where I did X, Y, and Z. Actually have it, readily available. Did you want me to show you where I built X, Y, and Z? And that way it gives you so much more strength, and you start leading the interview process. And when you start leading the interview process, you are way more likely to kind of pass through as opposed to when the interviewer is just like going through a checklist and you're not hitting the checklist that they want to see. So another thing is when you're displaying the project, you need to give enough context to it. A lot of people dig right into the code and they go into like, so I worked on this project and I had to build this, this, and this, and they didn't explain it. So they basically say like things like, I can only explain it with the context. Like it's really hard to give an example without the context, but you basically want to give like the use case of the project. So example can be, I worked on a project that was a replica of the popular board game Codenames. And then you can ask if they know what that game is and kind of go through the use case of it. You want to give that project and the scope first, and then dig into like the more technical details. If you go straight to the technical details, you can lose the interviewer, even if they're technical, because they don't have any idea of like what you did exactly. So, sometimes I get a lot of candidates go straight into the technical details, and as an interviewer, I'm kind of lost. So the idea is to go high level and then dig into the features. And if you're getting to a point where the interviewer is asking you questions about how you physically built something, then you know it's going well. If they're not that interested, then you know it's not going that well. Keep in mind that it is still a conversation. You don't want to spend like, hey, can I demo the project and then spend 20 minutes going through the project, because they may actually not be interested in going through the project. So you kind of have to read the situation. And then lastly, be prepared to dig deeper, as I mentioned. A lot of times people don't dig deep enough and through their code or remind themselves. And if you forget about your code, it shows really does not show well. It can hurt you, that part of the process that can help you. So if you are planning to show a project, make sure you're proud of it. I didn't kind of start with this, so make sure you're proud of it and you know how to talk to it, because of course it can hurt you if you show a project that, one, doesn't look like a great project, or two, you just don't know how you remember how you did it. Okay, there's always limited time. Everybody has limited time in these interviews. So make sure you show best first. That's kind of the rule of thumb. Don't think I'm going to lead up to my ultimate thing. You're going to probably end up happening is you're leading up, and then they're like, I don't want to see anything more. So just start with your most related first. Start with the big bang, like right away. You maybe lose your attention to your interviewer, so be selective. When you explain the project, tell the full story. So, you know, there's a thing called the STAR method that I always recommend. It's basically what I was talking about in the previous slide. Like, give the situation and project background first, then talk about, you know, what you did, what technologies you used, the process, and then talk about the particularities of what you did, and then talk about the result or the outcome. Don't forget the outcome as well, because if this was a project done for like school, let's say it was a capstone project and you won an award or something like that, or it was a work project and it saved money, that's very important, because seeing that you can build things that go to real value is of course very important for companies to hear that. Don't forget about talking about the technologies that you use, because as I mentioned earlier, stack is important, especially if it is the same exact stack as the company that they're looking for. And don't forget to give some context to, like, was this a group or individual project? What inspired you to do the project? These kind of things. So that's the most of that I wanted to talk about in terms of the interview, interview process about project walkthrough. I have one quick slide about Hatchways. I mentioned earlier, we help candidates, you know, get their next role, and we work a lot with startups. So our process is generally to do a take-home assessment. We do background blind. It's very much, our technologies are very much focused around the JavaScript stack or anything modern. So that's kind of, if you're interested in that, you'd probably want to take one of our assessments. And then if you do well, you can go straight into interview opportunities. If you don't perform as well, we have other programs such as our co-op program, where you end up working on a project in a team to build an outstanding portfolio item. So if you're interested in that, you can even go straight to that. You still have to do an assessment first so we know if your level is there, because we want to obviously make the team strong. And again, if you do well in that process, then there is interview and full-time opportunities. Jacqueline has put a link in the chat to our website, so you can kind of go there, read about it, and sign up if you are interested. And the thing I wanted to reiterate is, like, our co-op program, where people actually do projects. One interesting stat is we send interview opportunities about equally to people that haven't done our co-op program, so they haven't gotten a project with us, and those that have. And generally, those that do the project with us perform 50% better in interview opportunities. So even if you do a project and you don't even show it, we just know it helps in the process, because you'll gain so much knowledge about web development or JavaScript, or kind of like fundamentals that will help you in the interview process to do pair programming exercises, to ace those, you know, React take homes or things like that. So regardless if you're going to do anything, I just wanted you to take one thing away from this kind of presentation, is if you're looking for a new role, coming from a non-traditional background, building something is kind of one of the best things you can do to kind of overcome some of the barriers that you may face. And that's it. I just kind of go through some questions if we have any right now.
Just out of curiosity, I'm curious of the people who are here, who is currently looking for a job. Maybe you can use a raise hand button on Zoom or just type in the chat. And if you're not currently looking for a job, what's your current status? Are you learning? Are you currently working? Okay, got lots of hands up. Okay, nice. Okay, a ton of people are looking for jobs. Awesome. What would feel free to keep asking questions if you have any questions, but I might ask a few questions just to get context. What have been some of your biggest challenges and barriers in trying to land jobs at the moment for those who have their hands raised? Networking. Passing the algorithms challenge.
Yeah, definitely the algorithms challenge is a little tough. Yeah.
We should do something on that as well.
Any other topics or areas of the project walkthrough interview that you wanted to learn more about that wasn't covered in this presentation?
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
Let's see. You'd mentioned that if you did a group project, you should be honest about what you actually did on that project. How would you recommend showcasing a project in which you on which you worked in a group without either taking too much credit for or not enough credit for it?
Yeah, so the reason I think, so there's nothing wrong with showing the whole project as a whole kind of first. So just to start the project, the conversation. The only thing is like when you get asked specifics, this is where I mean like it's kind of good to be honest. And the reason is because companies do like when you are kind of showing that honesty and like showing that you're more of a team player. So when you describe things, use the words like we, or like as a team we did this, or I specifically worked on this with this team member. It just shows. It's funny because I learned this from my old manager, and he said one thing I look for in an interview is like, does the person use we or does the person use I? And then I know from a cultural perspective if they're a good fit or not. So the point I was trying to make is nothing wrong with showing a team project and demonstrating the work. Is just like try to use the words we and not focus on just yourself, basically. Because generally, if you're a strong developer, then you might have done a lot of that project. And you don't, even if you've done a lot of it, you still don't want to come across as like, I basically did everything. Like that's not a great sign to show, basically. Yeah. I have some good questions in the chat. There was one about relatively small projects in your GitHub repo. So there's two things to this question. One is like, is it okay to have them? Which is like kind of, I guess, the direct question you're having. Is like, there's nothing wrong with having small projects in your repo, and you know, showing more repos and more interest in building out little things. That's totally fine. The only thing I was trying to make about what makes it a great project is there's an immense amount of extra value in having a project that is more complicated and more involved. So if you're thinking about, let's say you have like 3 small projects on your GitHub repo and you're thinking about the next project, it's better to, you know, even build off of your old one and build it more complicatedly and like build it more than to just think about having small projects, especially if you're a recent bootcamp grad, because you probably look like a lot of other bootcamp grads if you all have relatively small projects. Is that what you did in your bootcamp? So it's good to take the post program of the bootcamp to be like, I'm gonna build something amazing that's gonna blow the mind of recruiters. So that's kind of how I think about that question. There's another question about, do you prefer projects to implement some sort of semi-difficult DSNA paradigm? Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So like, the question is, do you prefer having some sort of difficult data structure and algorithm implementation in the project? It's not a necessity. It will be a way to show complexity, but it's definitely not a necessity. So is a lot of companies that still use data structure and algorithm type of interviews, and those are generally larger companies. And whereas a lot of smaller companies care not as much about that. So there are interview processes that I'm aware of that they don't even have data structure and algorithms. And I know people that are struggling on that are like, where do I find those? I mean, with enough applying, you'll find those. But the way that they care about it is like, do you have practical experience? So building out practical based projects can be just as important. Really depends on the company than building out ones with difficult like data structure and algorithm paradigms. And on that note, if you do want to practice data structure and algorithms and do them, you might as well put them together. So some good projects people have done, I've seen, are like pathfinding relating projects, like building a bot that like does some sort of pathfinding algorithm with graph theory related stuff, or like building some sort of game that involves that. That's a good example of a project. Someone's asked, do you need to ask permission to showcase a project? I mean, you have to kind of read, that's kind of more of a behavioral, like kind of soft skills thing. You kind of have to read the situation if the person is, do you need to ask permission? Generally, I think it's good to ask permission unless they ask you like, can you demo me a project? And then you don't need to ask permission. But generally, I think it's good practice to just say like, I'd like to show you a project, you know, is it a good use of time right now? Basically, because you don't want to like say, you want to just take over the interview and then just go on a tangent. That can be problematic too if they want to ask you specific questions, basically. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a final round interview tomorrow, and I missed some features on the technical assessment. So I want to know what what ways can I stand out? I thoroughly researched like the company, the product, but what ways to make me, you know, put my best foot forward?
I don't want to stress you out because it's tomorrow, but candidates in the past have gone past that by actually implementing those features on their own time. And literally, I think, Jacqueline, we had some candidate this week that redid their project.
Just today. So initially we had a candidate who did not pass the assessment, and the employer was setting up the meeting to walk them through why they didn't pass. But instead the candidate came when completed all the features that was initially asked, and it blew the employer away and said, okay, I'm going to put you to final round. So I know you don't have that much time because it's tomorrow, but that is a tip. I mean, do what you can. Maybe even if you don't want to build it out right now because you don't have time, at least like recognizing and verbally walking through what you could have done better, it could be a good step forward.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I had to learn TypeScript and some other things, and I built out some features that I missed. I just wanted to know if, I mean, that's going to be like a hindrance because it's like an apprenticeship program. So I know, you know, maybe more certain things.
Yeah, with apprenticeship programs, I still think you're going to need to stand out because there's so many applicants nowadays. So
yeah. I think the one thing I always tell candidates is, you know, especially earlier career folks, is the one thing that you have on against like experienced candidates is your hunger and energy and your drive. And so the more you can showcase that in an interview by saying, hey, like, look, I'm really eager to learn this new technology, even though I don't have any experience with it, I'm super eager to learn it, or going above and beyond and take home assessments or interviews, like all of that energy and drive really goes a long way for people who are early in career.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
We have one more question. Yeah, so there's a question about the weight on competitive coding, lead code hackathons. So my answer to that question is some companies will put weight on it, some companies won't, and that's really what it's going to come down to. If you're asking me personally, I put weight on like what. It's kind of weird. I'm trying to get to this point where it's like everybody can shine in different ways. One way to shine is lead code. And if you happen to be very skilled at that, it can be a very valuable skill set depending on what the role is. Sometimes it's valuable, sometimes it's not. So ideally, in an ideal situation, companies are interviewing for what they really care about. So it can be important. Again, it's going to have to come back to, are you actually really skilled at it? Is it something you enjoy doing? Then if it is, then you should like double down and become an expert in it. If it's not, then maybe you kind of reevaluate where in development you can kind of shine, and it may not be competitive coding. But there are candidates that have blown me away. We've hired them, they've been amazing, that are good at that. And there's candidates that are terrible at that and amazing at other things, and have also blown us away in different ways, basically.
So I should put my Code Wars score on my resume.
Some people do. Some people put those kind of scores on their resume, and it does show like I do competitively code or things like that.
I do the coding challenges event every month, so I'm always doing problems, and I do a lot of katas, and I actually make them. I've made one and submitted translations for some.
Nice. Yeah. So I mean, there has been candidates that I've seen that has helped them get through the process. And sometimes if you do like hackathon or HackerRank challenges, you can get interview opportunities directly from like HackerRank or some of these websites, basically.
A lot of big companies are using HackerRank for tests too, like Amazon, Axon here in Seattle, GoDaddy gave me HackerRank, so it's good practice to do it because you probably show up in an interview.
Exactly.
Any final questions? Nope.
Okay.
I have one last question. Sorry.
Sure.
So like during the project walkthrough, should you, I guess you want to focus on maybe a feature that's really like your best feature first, or before you like trying to wrap up, just to be cognizant of the time, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, sometimes the best feature can be a bit subjective. So try to give like an overview of I was saying choose your best project and then like give an overview of the whole project. And then sometimes the interviewer might want to hone into one, and you can guide that by focusing in on more about the kind of the interesting things that you worked on, basically. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, CLJS, for having me. I really enjoyed this talk, and thanks to everybody for joining.